comrades, in thinking about this talk about the Pope's recent visit. I was trying to think, what about me makes me qualified to speak about the Pope? Because I haven't got a religious background. None of my three parents were religious. My father, my stepfather, and my mother. But then I remembered something which I think I need to disclose to you. And that is that my father's father, who I never met because he died before I was born, he was an Irish artist, a painter. And he was the first Irish artist to be commissioned to paint a portrait of a pope. I thought that would get your attention. Pope Leo XIII. He painted his portrait in 1885. I used to see that portrait. My father had a reproduction of it. And it didn't dispose me that much toward my grandfather. But it's interesting, because I read a little bit about it in his autobiography. He had a different concept of what the painting should be like than what the Pope thought. And so they had a number of discussions about it. And he kind of won the Pope over to the idea that it shouldn't be one of these regal kind of, portraits with the holy light behind him and all that, but that it should show him as a thinker. So the picture of the Pope that he did was of a man sitting at a desk, kind of looking to one side. Anyway, does that really qualify me? Well, I don't think it does. I don't think that I got any DNA from my grandfather on this question, or even anything having to do with artistic ability, for that matter. I think really what better qualifies me to give this talk is that I'm a Marxist, and that Marxism has contributed a great deal to understanding religion. Now, if you asked most people about Karl Marx and religion, what they would probably say is, oh yeah, he said religion was the opium of the people. And I'll get to that in a minute. And I'll read you the whole quote from Marx, so you can understand what he meant, because it's very different from what the enemies of Marxism want you to think. But first of all, you should know that Marx, when he was writing on this subject, was speaking to those of his generation, and this was halfway through the 19th century, who were studying philosophy in order to understand the relationship between ideas and the material world. Marx was a materialist. Now, that not in that crude sense in which this word is often used today, that means someone who only values material possessions and, the more the better. No, he was a materialist, meaning he studied the real world in which we live, and he saw that ideas are a reflection of the material reality, not the other way around. Not that reality is a reflection of ideas, somebody's idea. And he also defined what it was that led to huge changes in society over the course of human history. And that view is called historical materialism. Human societies have moved forward by bettering the tools and techniques we use to produce what we need to survive. It's improvement in these so-called means of production that have brought about changes in the relations among people themselves. All over the world, before there was written history, small bands of people were able to survive because of cooperation and sharing. And Marx called this stage of human development an early form of communism. The commune, I mean, he didn't invent that word. They lived in a society based on communes, communal living, a sharing, a community. This is what enabled people to survive in the harshest natural conditions, from the Arctic to the deserts. But eventually, with improvements in tools and techniques, our species was able to produce a surplus over what was needed just to survive. And it has been the struggle over this surplus that has created the divisions in society, the haves versus the have-nots, the struggle between social classes, in ancient times between slave owners and the people that they enslaved, later between the landlords and the serfs, and in modern times between capitalists and wage workers. Now, Karl Marx and his close collaborator Friedrich Engels first became famous for a very popular book called the Communist Manifesto. It was written during the democratic revolutions of 1848 in Europe, in which they participated. I think Engels got some military experience, actually. The book, the Communist Manifesto, said that the development of the means of production had gone so far and so fast that it was finally possible, realistic, to build a communist society on a new basis, where instead of people sharing what little they had, productivity had advanced to the point that everyone could have the means not only to live a comfortable, secure life, they could, at the same time, this surplus was enough for society to collectively develop the arts, education, science, everything needed, not just for survival, but for the flourishing of civilization. But that this wouldn't happen automatically. It would take revolutionary struggle against the ruling classes to bring socialism and later communism into being. So where does religion fit into this? Marx, in writing on religion, was no doubt speaking to the rationalists of his day, the people who saw religion as a reactionary phenomenon, opposed to scientific reasoning, and they thought, well, you can just abolish it. But he wanted to understand this question much more deeply. So let us get to the quote that I was talking about, which he wrote in a piece called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, written in the 1840s. This is what he said. He said, religious suffering. Now that's a term that comes from Christianity. It means people sharing the suffering of Jesus Christ through adopting religious belief. So he says, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, you must know that at that time, opium was not a recreational drug. It was not used in that way, and certainly not by the masses. It was a painkiller. It killed pain. It deadened pain. People would take opium if they had to have a tooth pulled, for example, or women who worked in the hellish textile factories on 12 and 14-hour shifts, and who were still nursing babies and had to have them brought to the factory to be with them for part of the day at least, would give their babies something called laudanum. Laudanum was a derivative of opium, and it made them sleep and be quiet while the women worked. This was the kind of suffering that he was talking about when he talked about the opium of the people, deadening the pain of their existence. And then he went on to talk about the abolition of religion to his colleagues, who were not very religious, right? He said, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. So you see, he had a very deep and profound understanding of why religions existed. He wasn't talking just about Catholicism or Christianity. He was talking about religion as it has developed around the world, on every continent. Certainly, we should be able to understand how the veil of tears created in Western Asia and North Africa by, first of all, colonialism, and more recently by these brutal imperialist wars of regime change, has left hundreds of millions of suffering people with little to hold on to except their religions. And when you mentioned Malcolm X and his importance to the struggle here, and we think of Dr. Martin Luther King, we think of religion in that context. But religion among people is one thing. The established churches are another. And few have been established and powerful longer than the Catholic Church. We wrote in Workers' World about how comforting it must have been for virtually all the warring political camps in the U.S. to seemingly come together in great praise for Pope Francis and his talk to the UN about the Millennial Development Goals. I'm not going to repeat everything that's in that article. You can read it in the paper or online, but I will try to summarize a lot of the points in it. We focused on the fact that the Pope, when he came here and spoke at a number of different things, received a level of media coverage that a rock star could only wish for. And after that, that came, right, this outpouring for the Pope, after the papers had been, and the media had been saturated with such terrible news. Police killings of unarmed black people, corruption on Wall Street, the widening gap between rich and poor, the drought and the raging wildfires in the West that are directly linked to global warming, the vicious Republican debates and the gridlock in Congress. And the international news was even more painful. A mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of desperate people from the war-torn areas of the Middle East. So the visit of Pope Francis gave the capitalist media the opportunity to offer people who suffer themselves or identify with the suffering masses some hope. His speeches were full of eloquent concern about the fate of the earth, the suffering of migrants, and the growth of poverty and obscene wealth. And I think he even mentioned the word capitalism at some point. It is increasingly clear that what he said resonates very much with what people want to hear. And many of them hope that what he said is going to propel forward the struggles for reform in these areas. But what about the church's reactionary positions on sex, including divorce, contraception, abortion, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer rights? Nothing that Pope Francis said challenged the Vatican's age-old role as a world pillar of male domination and the consigning to hell of all who dare to challenge it. In fact, during his visit, he made a point of meeting with the clerk in Tennessee who had denied marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And he told her, keep up the good work. He also, while he was here, conveyed sainthood on a Spanish missionary Junipero Serra, who in the 1780s had offered the hundreds of thousands of native people living in Lower California the choice of converting to Catholicism or being forcibly removed from the lands their ancestors had farmed for centuries. And Serra enforced his edicts with flogging, shackles, and imprisonment. But this pope named him to sainthood. It should be obvious that the U.S. big business media all speak for various elements of the capitalist ruling class. Even the most liberal of them never go beyond criticism or editorial positions intended to patch up and prettify this increasingly unbearable system. Far be it from any of them to ever side with those who advocate a revolutionary solution to the decay of outmoded capitalism. Their enthusiasm, the media, the capitalist media, their enthusiasm for the Pope's pronouncements, therefore, must be seen in the context of present-day struggles. Here in the United States, these struggles are becoming more acute as the exploitation of the working class and the even fiercer oppression of its most downtrodden sections, people of color and immigrants especially, have aroused a significant section of the population. The young, particularly, are showing outright defiance of the state and its repressive functions, especially in relation to police violence and mass incarceration. Now, the Catholic Church has a long history, and it has amassed extreme wealth over the centuries. But its influence today should not be exaggerated. The Church has been in decline for many years, especially in Europe, the cradle of the Catholic Church. It was long ago superseded there by various Protestant religions that arose from the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the feudal lords and who were in cahoots with the Church. The Enlightenment period, which rejected Catholic dogma, opened the way for the development of science and industry, the pillars of early capitalism. Now, this is not early capitalism anymore. Capitalism has entered its imperialist stage. Now it's the banks and other financial institutions, more than the commercial and industrial capitalists, that call the shots. The growing world economy has been dominated mainly by, not by Catholics, but by so-called WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Europe and North America, who ruled through such institutions as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Not very holy institutions, right? But in this century, while this has been happening, and while the Church has lost a lot of its power, there have been a lot of challenge. It isn't only this development. There's been a lot of challenges to imperialist rule, right? There's been revolutions in Russia, China, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba that succeeded, at least for a while, and some permanently, in overturning capitalist property relations and trying to build socialism. These revolutions were secular. They summoned the efforts of the masses of people to improve their conditions, rather than looking for the help of a supposed higher power. But they faced problems of extreme underdevelopment and ferocious hostility from the imperialists, and we know it has hurt them. It has hurt these revolutions tremendously. Why, in Eastern Europe, the Catholic Church became a conduit for counter-revolution. Pope John Paul II, who was Polish, played a big part in the return of Eastern European countries to the fold of global capitalism. And that earned him and the Church great praise from non-Catholics in the bourgeoisie, especially in the U.S. But it did not reverse the historically declining fortunes of the Vatican. We also have to look at the rise of the women's movement and the struggle for reproductive choice, as well as revelations of child sexual abuse by a supposedly celibate Catholic clergy. plus an influx of people from other nationalities and religions. All these things have led to a decline in the influence and finances of the church, especially in Western Europe. Today, for example, there are more practicing Muslims in France than there are practicing Catholics. That's a fact. And in Italy, home of the Vatican, though 5 years ago, those who attended Mass every Sunday made up less than 5% of the population. And the figure, of course, was even lower among the young people. And this is all statistics from the Center for the Study of New Religions. But in Latin America, and this is important for us because, first of all, Latin America is on the same part of the globe as us, and there were many, many immigrants from Latin America in the United States. The situation with the Catholic Church has been more complex. Beginning in the 60s, the struggle of the masses against brutal dictatorships propped up by the U.S. with arms and money shook the Catholic hierarchy. The struggles attracted many priests and nuns, especially those closest to the poor. There was a new brand of Catholicism, liberation theology, that put emphasis on raising up the most oppressed and was sympathetic to revolutionary forces in the hemisphere, including the Cuban Revolution. I was once in Havana, and I was surprised to see a very tall, distinguished older woman with an enormous big wooden cross on her chest entering one of the hotels. And somebody told me that she was the mother of one of the Colombian revolutionary priests. And I'm sorry, I can't think of his name right now, but some of you may remember. And she was in Havana because she couldn't live in Colombia because he was a revolutionary. Some of the advocates of liberation theology participated in these armed struggles. Priests and nuns in this movement became targets of the dictators, most notably in Central America. You remember the murders actually, I think in a cathedral of El Salvador's Archbishop Oscar Romero, and also the 4 Maranol religious women who were raped and murdered. Also in Argentina and Brazil. But the Vatican denounced liberation theology. Now, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who is the present Pope Francis, is from Argentina. He was not part of this progressive, even revolutionary movement that reached into the clergy in Latin America. The military in Argentina launched a coup in 1976, completely supported by Washington, and they then carried out a vicious war against the left, in which thousands of people, most of them young, were disappeared. Some of them later turned out were actually thrown out of helicopters into the ocean. The military eventually, though, had to pull back, and a civilian government returned there. Now, it was Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, who anointed Bergoglio as a cardinal in 2001. When Bergoglio became Pope 2 years ago, information surfaced about the complicity of the Argentine church with the crimes of the generals. Bergoglio was accused of not having used his position because he was a bishop at the time of the Dirty War. So he had quite a bit of power in the church. Not having used it to save priests and others imprisoned by the junta. But now this Bergoglio has risen to the position of Pope, and he is talking about the suffering of the poor and other things that progressive people want to hear. This reflects a new world reality, really. Throughout Latin America, there is little sympathy for the reactionary forces that were lined up with U.S. imperialism in that period of multiple military coups and vicious dictatorships. There have been big changes from Venezuela to Chile, Guatemala, Paraguay. Even the corrupt and murderous political establishment in Colombia has had to sit down in Havana with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and negotiate an end to the war there. The new Pope is able to articulate the sentiments of the masses of oppressed people with great passion and seeming humility. Yet the institution he represents, except for a small and valiant grouping from which he distanced himself, has been opposed to the struggles of the people to take control of their lives in the now, rather than wait for the hereafter. By praising this Pope to the skies, we can assume that the capitalist establishment in the U.S. is hoping the church can help keep the movement for change in safe channels. They don't want to see the struggle for immigrant rights, for example, or the movement against racist police killings, mass incarceration, and executions, prison executions. They don't want to see this movement adopt the militant tactics of the Black Lives Matter youth, for example. By the way, many within the BLM movement are women and or queer. And they aren't going to take advice from the church, no how. The great problems and suffering caused by the frenzied capitalist trampling of the world in search of profits are multiplying daily. They are inevitably leading to massive showdowns between the workers and the oppressed, on the one hand, and the forces of repression that serve the class of the super-rich. Many religious people will take part in these struggles, have taken part, especially those who suffer the most, those who are the poorest. They will need solidarity and support from the whole movement in exercising their right to disobey any reactionary teachings and edicts, even those concealed in uplifting language that come from the church hierarchies. Sort of two subjects that we've covered tonight. One has to do with organized religion and the machinations that go on, and the hypocrisy, and the way in which it is really part of the whole structure of class society, or the organized religion. But the other is the religion of the people. What makes people believe in religion? What makes people rely on religion? And that is much more complicated. I mean, there are atheist societies in this country, and some of them take some pretty reactionary positions, But mainly they treat religion as though it's nothing but a conspiracy to control the population. But it's much more than that. It goes much deeper than that. And it comes, as Marx said, it comes out of suffering, the veil of tears. We have to get rid of the veil of tears before people don't need religion anymore. And that's something that we have to remember. We had a comrade for a while in New Haven who was from Latin America and had been a priest. And he told me that what brought him to communism, he got tortured in Paraguay, and then he went to Cuba. He got tortured in Paraguay because he got a job through the World Council of Churches, and they sent him to Paraguay to be a priest there. And he had progressive ideas, but he was a priest, And he was tortured and they broke his fingers because it was a horribly right-wing, repressive, fascist dictatorship in Paraguay, and the World Council of Churches was seen as too close to the communist world. So after that, he went to Cuba to sort of recuperate, and he said that actually what led him in the direction of atheism, which is where he was when I met him, was talking to the priests in Cuba. The priests in Cuba won him over to revolution. Before that, he was kind of naive, about a lot of things. But he was talking to the priests in Cuba because they were the ones who hadn't left when the revolution came. This is a small section of who had been priests beforehand. A lot of them, I think the majority of them actually had been from Spain. They weren't even Cubans. And they went back to Spain at the time of the revolution. But I thought that was really interesting. But yes, we should, in our relationship with people who are believers in any religion, we should not be cynical, we should not be scoffing, we should not belittle their beliefs. We should understand those beliefs are a response to a world that seems like a hell on earth, to them particularly, because so many of the people who are really deep believers in religion are also people who are horribly treated under this repressive global system of capitalism. That's it.
That Steve did too, about the religion of the oppressed, because I think it's very important for us as communists to understand that even from a social point of view, what the church means for oppressed people, especially black people. Right. We have comrades who are very loyal to the party, who go to church because of the social. The social aspects of it, the dinners, the singing, the programs, it means a lot to them because of the whatever alienation or isolation, comrades of color may feel, or any oppressed person of color may feel, and also the role of the church in the struggle. The 16th Baptist Church, right, that was bombed in 1963. That wasn't done randomly, although there was a lot of, they called Birmingham Bombingham because there were so many bombings at the time. But that church was targeted because it was an activist church. A lot of meetings, on the civil rights movement, a lot of youth met there, to talk about, going to jail and, against segregation and so forth. And that's what happened in Charleston. Right. The Church of Denmark Vesey, that was an activist church, and Dylan Roof said that's why he targeted. He said this is an activist church, So anyway, it is very important for us to distinguish between the organized, aspect of the church, but also distinguish it and understand, be sensitive towards the religion of oppressed people, because the church played a very activist role in the struggle against slavery.